All right, everyone. Hello. And we're going to begin chapter 8 today. That is production costs. You will recall that in chapter 7, we looked at production technology. That is, we tried to describe the relationship between different combinations of production inputs and the highest level of output that combination could get you. And we called that relationship between inputs and outputs production technology. And so we were describing there a physical relationship. Even though it was sort of a black box, we said these inputs go into this black box and then the maximal output comes out for each given production technology. We were nevertheless describing a physical relationship between inputs and outputs that we call technology. Now, there is a very close association between what we're going to do in this chapter and what we did with the chapter 7, because in chapter 8 we're talking about production costs. And so what we're going to do here is look at, for any given combination of inputs, we know the associated maximal output for the production technology. But if we also know what the costs or the prices, the market prices of those inputs are, then for any given combination of inputs, we know how much that combination would cost. And therefore, we know what the cost of the associated level of output is in that technology. In a way, when we looked at the isoquants, we said, okay, for this given level of output and this production technology, these at every point on that isoquant was some input combination that would produce that level of output. And so now that we know the prices of those input combinations, we can say all the different costs that would be borne by the firm using those different combinations of inputs. And we therefore would have some relationship between all the different costs and some level of output, and the firm, being astute as it is, would choose that input combination that would produce the given level of output at least cost. Now, that was a long run notion. But we also, have this short run notion, and as I was saying, a firm is always in a short run. It always has some fixed inputs. So what we want to do is also relate, for our simple short run production function that only has one variable input, we want to be able to relate what the cost of output is as we vary output, which of course implies that we're also varying the input. So there's a direct relationship. Once we know the short run production function, we know, what every level of L will produce, and we know the price of L, we know what every level of output will cost. So our focus now is going to move strictly from the inputs to looking at a function, what we call a cost function, that relates the total cost to the firm of a given quantity of output. So we're going to push the actual capital and labor to a little lower level. It's there, but we're going to price it, and we're going to focus on the cost of the input combinations, or the total amount of input being used if we're talking about the short run. So let me move to a PowerPoint here, and we can talk about this using the slides that come from both McGraw-Hill and companion to your textbook, and some of mine. So what we're going to be doing in this chapter, this chapter has a lot of taxonomy to it, just definitional sorts of concepts or definitions of concepts. And so we're going to look at different types of costs and the characteristics of each. And then we're going to also understand the concepts of average and marginal costs. And what we're going to find is that average cost is very closely related to average product, as you would think. And marginal cost is very closely associated to marginal product. And, as I was just saying, we want to be able to identify a firm's least cost input choice and the firm's cost function in the short and the long run. all right, in both the short and the long run. Today, we're going to deal just with the short run. And we also want to describe how changes in the relative prices of inputs will affect the firm's choice on input combination. This, as you would imagine, if one input gets more expensive relative to another input, and there is substitution between inputs allowed, then we would anticipate the firm in the long run will make those substitutions. And again, as always, we have to make this all important distinction between short run and long run cost. And then we're also going to look at economies and diseconomies of scale, which are the cost counterpart to when we talked about returns to scale. We had said increasing returns to scale and decreasing returns to scale were reflected in that isoquant map. They're going to have a counterpart on the cost side. Costs in production are two sides of the same coin. We call this, sometimes we call duality. And I'll show you some simple elements of this duality, how I can get average product and marginal product directly from average product and, I can get average cost and marginal cost directly from average product and marginal product if I know, the cost of the input whose average and marginals we're trying to look at. So, several types of costs here, and I'll go through each of them: fixed versus variable, short run; avoidable versus sunk, also a distinction that only exists in the short run; and out-of-pocket versus opportunity costs. And, we start with the simple case of one variable input, and then we expand to, cost minimization questions with two variable inputs, our long run concept notion. And, we have ISO cost lines, which are going to look a lot like a budget constraint. And we're going to then generate cost curves from the total product curves, or the average and marginal product curves. We're going to use those to get our cost curves. And, in the short run, relative to the long run, we're going to demonstrate that costs can be lower in the long run, because in the short run, you're stuck with a fixed input and it may not be optimal. But as I said, the long run, your planning horizon, you determine what the optimal combination would be. And since all inputs are variable in the long run, you would move to the optimal input combination. So your short run costs are always going to be equal to or higher than your long run costs. As firms grow and increase, we have this notion of economies of scale. And we're not going to go over this. This in your textbook, economies of scope, is that the more related activities a firm takes on, there are economies of scope, implying the gamut or the suite of activities that the firm is undertaking its production. So types of cost. When we look at total cost in the short run, again, this is a short run notion. We have a variable cost and a fixed cost. The reason this is a short run concept is because in the short run, by its definition, there is a fixed input, at least one fixed input. So whatever the cost of that input is per unit, the number of units is fixed, that cost will be fixed. And we vary output only because we have a variable input that enables us to vary output. And so as we use more or less of that variable input, the cost associated with that variable input is going to vary with the quantity of the input used, right? So in the long run, since all inputs are variable, by its very definition, there is no fixed input, there is no fixed cost. Now, when we look at fixed costs, we further distinguish between avoidable fixed costs and sunk fixed costs. Now, avoidable fixed costs are costs that the firm does not incur if it produces no output. Let me give you an example. Suppose a dentist has to have malpractice insurance, or a physician has to have malpractice insurance. And suppose that malpractice insurance costs $4,000 a month. I have no idea what it would cost in reality, but suppose it costs $4,000 a month. It's a fixed cost. It doesn't vary depending on how many patients the dentist or the doctor sees over the course of the month. It's just fixed. Now, he pays us $4,000 at the beginning of every month. If the dentist decides to retire and shut down his business, then he'll cancel his insurance policy and he'll no longer have to pay that $4,000 a month. So that is a fixed cost because it's $4,000 a month regardless, but it is avoidable if the dentist shuts down his business. He cancels the policy. He no longer has to bear that cost. Now, sunk cost, on the other hand, for that dentist would be if he's renting his office and he can't sublet it. So let's suppose he pays $60,000 a year in rent for the building in which his practice is located. He pays that rent regardless of whether his business is operating or not. This would assume that he cannot cancel the lease. He cannot cancel the lease. So he has to go ahead and pay out the rest of the year. Now, that cost is sunk. He can't escape it by shutting down. If I were to think in terms of someone, suppose I wanted to open up a bar in Lubbock by campus. I don't know why I want to do it during COVID-19, but suppose I wanted to open a bar and I have to have a liquor license. And that liquor license is non-refundable, non-transferable. So again, I have no idea what a liquor license costs, but suppose it's $10,000. So I have to buy that liquor license. It's a fixed cost. It doesn't matter whether I have one person in my bar or I have 10,000 people in my bar. It doesn't matter. It's fixed. But since it's non-refundable and non-transferable, if I go out of business in 3 months, I don't get any of that money back, 10,000 back, nor can I transfer or sell my liquor license to anybody else to get some of that money. So it's sunk, the 10,000. Once I make that payment to the city to get my liquor license, that $10,000 is gone. Now, types of costs, we talk about opportunity cost, and this is the cost associated with foregoing let me look at that. Opportunity cost is the cost associated with foregoing the opportunity to employ a resource in its best alternative use. Now, contrast that to the notion of out-of-pocket or accounting cost to the business. This is the actual cost paid by the firm for that resource. The two are really quite different. Opportunity cost will, in general, be greater than accounting cost. Now, let's think about a business that owns its own building. Let me go back to my dentist and suppose that my dentist does not rent from anyone. He owns outright the building in which his practice is located. So his accounting cost for that business would be essentially zero. He has to pay insurance on it and property taxes and that sort of stuff. But if we just think about the cost of the rent, he says I pay no rent. I am the owner of the building, so my accounting cost in terms of rent is zero. But in an economics class, we don't think that way. We think about how much could he have rented that business for. We can subtract the taxes and the insurance. How much could he have rented that business for? And if another dentist would have paid him $50,000 a year for that building space, to rent that building space, he needs to figure that the cost of the building has a rent of $50,000 associated with it. So even though he doesn't collect the rent, he needs to think in terms of paying himself that rent because he is foregoing that rent by using the building himself. So if he is correctly accounting for all of his costs in an economic sense, when he goes to work out his profits, he needs to think of the fact that he could have rented that building to somebody else for $50,000. Therefore, it needs to enter into his calculus as a $50,000 cost. So whenever we talk about economic profits versus accounting profits, when we talk about economic profits, we're talking about total revenues less total costs, where all of the costs are opportunity costs. Now, in a lot of cases, opportunity costs and accounting costs are going to be the same, but there are important differences. That one I just argued. You know, if someone were to quit their job, suppose you've got a job, you're making $60,000 a year, and you decide, I'm going to go into business for myself. And so you start the business in your garage, you basically don't pay yourself anything. Your accounting costs don't have you down as an employee of the business who is earning anything. So you're, you know, in an accounting sense, your cost is zero. But you quit a job paying you $60,000 a year. So clearly, in your best alternative occupation, you could earn at least $60,000 a year. So when you're thinking about whether your business is making money or not, it's not the fact that you cost zero. The fact is you've given up $60,000 to go there and work for zero. So you need to correctly account for yourself in an opportunity cost sense as $60,000, not zero or $10,000 or whatever you pay yourself. So, you know, firms' true economic costs are going to be both out-of-pocket expenditures and opportunity costs, but its true economic costs, you know, this distinction is here only to the extent that, you know, out-of-pocket expenditures deviate from opportunity costs. So cost functions then are the functional relationship between quantity produced and cost of production, between quantity and the cost associated for that quantity. So a cost function is total cost, in this case, some function of Q. Now note there's no K and L in this per se, but it comes from those input uses. So, you know, you take a two-input production function. If the cost of a unit of labor is W, which we call the wage rate, and the cost of a unit of capital, R, which we call the rental rate, the total cost of efficient production then is going to be the total expenditure on labor, which will be the product, wage rate times quantity of labor, plus RK, which will be then the total expenditure on capital. So labor and capital are given, you know, by just the Q we're talking about here is the Q that arises from the production function. You know, this function of capital and labor, these two labor inputs. So we have a short-run cost function, which is simply the functional relationship between quantity produced and cost of production. When in our world here, our two-input world, one input is variable and the other input is fixed. And so we're going to have labor as our variable input. So a short-run cost function then is going to reflect the cost of production, the variable cost of production, as labor varies, our labor input varies, which is then itself represented by a change in the quantity of output. And all of this when we're holding capital inputs fixed. So in the short run, you know, this isn't a very good look there, but total cost is going to be the rental rate times the fixed quantity of capital, plus then the expenditure on labor. And so what do we really have here? We have this, since K is fixed, this first term is going to be a fixed cost. We can't vary K in the short run, and R is fixed in the capital market. So that's fixed. And WL then, which, well, W stays constant, but the product of W times L will vary as we vary L. So we have a variable cost there. So just going back to our basic, you know, two-input world here, we can observe, you know, the underlying capital and labor here that generate for us a fixed cost and a variable cost. So we have these short-run cost functions. We have this variable cost function, short-run variable cost function. We have a fixed cost, which isn't really a function, it's just a constant. And then we have a total cost, which is the sum of the fixed plus the variable cost. Now note, we show this FC, there is no function of Q here. That would be inappropriate since fixed costs don't depend in any way on quantity Q. Only variable cost depends on quantity. So this is the way we would draw our total cost function here. Now, the fixed costs may contain both sunk and avoidable fixed costs, all right? And only sunk fixed costs cannot be eliminated in the short run by shutting down. So note, if my business shuts down, that is to say, Q equals 0, then the portion of fixed costs, which is sunk, will still have to be borne by the business. But if it sets Q equal to 0, so it shuts down, it can avoid the avoidable fixed costs. All right. So to the extent there are both avoidable and fixed costs, then if the firm produces 0, it can only avoid the avoidable portion of those fixed costs. So here again from your textbook, we had our garage space, which was a fixed input of 1,000 square feet, and one assembly worker working with this 1,000 square feet was able to produce 33 garden benches. Well, the square footage costs $1 per week, so we have a fixed cost everywhere of $1,000. It doesn't change as we change the number of workers. But one assembly worker costs $500 per week. So that tells us 33 benches will cost 1,000 plus 500 or 1,500. Note, now 2 workers can produce 74 benches. So the total cost of 74 benches will be 1,000 plus 1,000 spent on our 2 assembly workers, our labor, or a total of 2,000. Now note, just as we're going along, that the average cost declined there. And we can produce with 4 workers 132 garden benches, which at $500 per worker per week generates a variable cost of $2,000 added to the fixed cost of 1,000, so $3,000 per week. Now our focus here is going to be on quantity of benches and total cost or variable cost. We're not going to worry anymore about the actual number of labor workers. In fact, we're going to smooth out this quantity so that it's continuous. So we might have 10 garden benches that would require, 1/4 of an assembly worker, or a variable cost of 125, so it'd be 1125. So that's what we want to do. We want to relate Q to total cost or variable cost. So here's an example. Suppose the production function, short-run production function, is Q equals 2L. Then what that tells us is, just inverting this, that the amount of labor required to produce any given quantity of output will be Q over 2. And so since labor is the only input in this scenario, then our cost function, which we say is a function of Q, not of L, of Q, will be W times Q over 2. So if the wage rate is $15 per hour, then the variable cost function will be the wage rate times Q over 2, which will be 7.5 Q. So that tells us what the variable cost is for any given value of Q. If the firm also has sunk costs of 100 per week, then its weekly total cost function would be 100 plus 7.5 Q. And this is the cost function. Again, I stress, cost is a function of Q, but it comes from this production relationship. So here we are. Here's our production function. This is for our garden benches. One worker produced 33 benches. And so we come over here and we said, okay, well, 33 benches costs in variable cost terms, just for the worker, $500. So this is, a really good picture of that duality that I was talking about. So we had 2 workers who produced 80 garden benches. So I come over here, from the production function side, I come over to the variable cost side. So that says 80 garden benches require 2 workers at $500 per worker. So 80 garden benches has a variable cost associated with it of $1,000. And of course, 4 produce whatever it was, 120 or 130, I don't recall. But again, we're taking this production relationship, we're adding in the cost of labor, and we're getting then a cost function, a variable cost function in this case. So, the cost curve, the total cost curve, then is going to be the variable cost curve, just shifted up by the amount of fixed costs. So for our garden bench example, we had $1,000 fixed cost. We have this variable cost relationship. So to get to total cost, we would put this variable cost curve on top of the fixed cost curve, have the same intercept here, and we would then have total cost, where the difference between these 2 curves is everywhere then fixed cost. Now, average cost and marginal cost are, as you would imagine, average cost is the total cost averaged over all units produced. It's simply total cost. That's fixed cost plus variable cost divided by Q. That's pretty straightforward, just an average. Marginal cost, however, and this is a more important concept for us, is the extra cost a firm incurs per unit of output added. So the question is, if the firm produces 1 additional unit of output, it will have to engage enough variable input to produce just 1 additional unit of output. And what does that unit actually cost? Well, suppose we want to produce 1 additional unit of output, and that would require 1/4 of a unit of labor, and labor costs $20 an hour, $20 a unit. That would mean it would cost us $5 to produce an additional unit. That would be the marginal cost. So it's the change in total costs, which is, since fixed costs don't vary, that would be equal to the change in the only cost that can vary, which is variable cost. So it's the change in cost divided by the change in units of output. If we were to produce 3 additional units of output and our variable cost had to increase by $60 to produce 3 additional units of output, then we would say marginal cost would be 60 over 3, or 20. It costs us $20 per unit for those 3 additional units based on the increase in our variable cost. So, back to this again, cost, average cost, marginal cost for a hypothetical firm. So here's output, and here is total cost for each of those levels of output. And so what they're showing here is, well, marginal cost for the first unit, total cost, there is no fixed cost here apparently. So total cost is 0 for 0 units. When we produced the first unit, our cost went to $1,000. So the change, the incremental change in cost was 1,000, going from 0 to 1 unit. Going from 1 to 2 units, however, total cost went from 1,000 to 1,800. So the incremental change for the second unit was an additional $800. The incremental change for the third unit, you can see, is 2,100 minus 1,800, or 300, and so on. So for the fourth unit, it costs us 2,500 minus 2,100, or $400. So that the marginal cost is simply the change in total cost associated with the production of the marginal unit. Over here, just the average is pretty straightforward. We've got the total cost, 1,000 over 1 is 1,000, 1,800 over 2 is 900, 2,100 over 3 is 700, etc. There's a distinction between marginal cost and average cost. They're not the same. Now note here, marginal cost first falls and then begins to increase. Here, average cost first falls and then it begins to increase. Why so? Well, because of diminishing marginal returns. as I reach a point of a diminution, first I have increasing returns at low levels of output where my labor is using my capital stock. There isn't one here, but in general. And so when labor is getting more productive, I'm getting more output per unit of labor. That means since I pay the same for every unit of labor, that marginal cost is falling. But once the marginal product of my labor starts to decrease, then I'm getting less output per dollar for labor, where my marginal cost is increasing. Now, going from total cost to average cost is exactly as we did before in this particular scenario. When I have my total cost curve here, this would be a production that has no fixed input. If I take any point on the cost curve and I look at the slope from the origin, the slope of a line from the origin to that point on the cost curve, the slope of that line is rise, cost, over run, which is output. So that would be total cost over output is just average cost. So the slope of a line from anywhere to any point on the curve from the origin is average cost. And as you can see, average cost as this curve is drawn is decreasing. And once it reaches this point right at 6,000, the slope of the line cannot go any lower and touch a point on the cost curve. So that must be minimum average cost. And then as we move along the curve to this point at 8,000, it's rising again. So the slope of this line first decreases, reaches its minimum, and then starts increasing. And that's reflected over here in this drawing where we've just plotted the slope of that line from the origin to every point on the total cost curve. And that gave us the average cost curve. Now, marginal cost is, as you might imagine, the slope of the cost curve, because it's the changing cost over the changing quantity. And so the variable on the vertical axis is total cost, the variable on the horizontal axis is quantity. So change in cost over change in quantity is reflected by the slope of the total cost curve. Now here you can see the slope is going to steeper, it's getting flatter and flatter and flatter right until I hit this inflection point. So the cost curve goes from being concave to being convex. Right at this point then, marginal cost is going to be decreasing, curve is going to be getting flatter, and then it stops getting flatter, and it starts now getting steeper. So that marginal cost reaches its minimum point right where this line from the origin, note, is just tangent to the cost curve. I can't, it is at one and the same time, a line from the origin to a point on the cost curve, which is average cost, but it's also tangent to the cost curve, which is by definition, the slope of that line is then marginal cost. All right, so marginal cost is everywhere, the slope of the tangent line to the cost curve at any point. And so we graph then the slope of the total cost curve at every point, and we find that it reaches its minimum around here, 6,000, and then it begins to increase. This is the point at which the total cost curve goes from being concave to convex. So as you can see, marginal cost and average cost are going to coincide at that point of minimum average cost. All right. So the marginal cost curve intersects the average cost curve at the minimum point of the average cost curve, and marginal cost is rising. So no, whenever marginal cost is less than average cost, since the incremental increase to total cost is less than the average, it's going to pull the average down. Back to the 4 people in a room, average height is 6 feet. Someone walks in who's 5'8", it's going to pull the average down. So whenever marginal cost is less than average cost, it's causing average cost to fall. Whenever marginal cost is greater than average cost, so whenever the person walking into the room is taller than the average height in the room, it causes the average to increase. marginal cost will be pulling up average cost. So we conclude that whenever marginal cost is less than average cost is falling, and whenever marginal cost is greater than average cost is increasing. That must mean that when marginal cost is equal to average cost is at its minimum. Now, here again to this duality. If I look at average variable cost here, that is variable cost divided by Q, but my variable cost is composed in our world of my labor expense, W times L. So let me just rearrange this expression, and I get W is equal to Q over L, or average variable cost is simply the wage rate, fixed, divided by the average product of labor. And we argue that the average product of labor first falls and then rises. So average variable cost, average product of labor first increases and then falls. So when average product of labor is rising, average variable cost is falling. And when average product of labor begins to fall, then average variable cost begins to increase. So going back, what do I know? I know that over this interval, up to this level of output, that the average product of labor has been increasing. And now it starts to fall. So the average product is falling, so the average cost is increasing. Marginal cost, as we said, was change in cost, which is change in variable cost, because fixed cost can't change. So change in cost over change in Q is equal to change in variable cost over change in Q. And the wage rate is fixed, so the change in variable cost comes about only by virtue of changing our labor input. So the change in variable cost is going to be W times delta L. And I divide that by delta Q. If I rearrange that, what do I get? I get W over delta Q over delta L, quantity delta Q over delta L. That is the wage rate over marginal product. So when W is constant, you can see here, when marginal product is increasing, marginal cost is falling. So marginal cost falls to about this point, this level of output right here. And once we reach that level of output, then diminishing marginal returns set in. And when diminishing marginal returns set in, the marginal product starts to fall, so the marginal cost starts to rise. So here we are, three kinds of average cost. We have average variable cost, we have average fixed cost, and we also have average avoidable cost. All right, so we're going to have average, some fixed cost as well. So, a total avoidable cost now will be the sum of variable cost, which is 0 if Q is 0, and avoidable fixed cost. So we're introducing a new term here that you wouldn't have seen in your principles class. We have total avoidable cost, which are your variable costs plus your avoidable sunk costs. We have total avoidable costs. So we now have an average avoidable cost, which is going to have two components. It's going to have average variable cost and average avoidable fixed cost. So average avoidable cost is equal to that, average variable cost plus average avoidable fixed cost. And this also suggests if we have an avoidable fixed cost and a sunk fixed cost, then we would have at least three inputs. Perhaps we only have two inputs and all costs are avoidable, or perhaps we only have two inputs and all fixed costs are sunk, but we have this possibility now of some avoidable fixed costs and some sunk fixed costs. So here's what my curves are going to look like now. We already did the average cost curve here, this kind of orange one. Here's the marginal cost curve. It first decreases, and then diminishing marginal product sets in, and marginal cost starts to increase. It goes through the average cost curve at its minimum point. It's also going to go through the average avoidable cost curve at its minimum point, because the same logic applies. Whenever marginal cost is less than average avoidable cost, it's pulling the average down. Once it moves above average avoidable cost, it's going to pull it up. So it goes through the minimum point on average avoidable cost. And then here is average variable cost that does not include the average avoidable fixed costs. It's just total average variable cost, same deal. Whenever marginal cost is less, It's going to pull the average variable cost down. When marginal cost is greater, it's going to pull it up. So the marginal cost curve intersects all three of these average curves at their minimum point. Now, the vertical distance between the average avoidable cost curve and the average variable cost curve is the average fixed avoidable costs, avoidable fixed costs. Okay, so the difference here between these two curves is the fixed avoidable cost. And note, since it's fixed, as output increases, that ratio decreases. So these two curves are going to get closer and closer and closer together. And now the difference between average total cost and the average avoidable cost curve would be the average sunk fixed cost curve. So this production technology exhibits both a sunk fixed cost, a non-sunk or avoidable fixed cost, and a variable cost. All right. So I will give you some exercises on this, but for now, this is our depiction of short-run production cost, and it's short-run because we have some fixed component in our production process. Note, in the long run, all costs are avoidable, so we would have no fixed component. All right, there's my timer. So I will see you people in my next lecture, and we will tackle, all of our inputs, both capital and labor, are variable, and generate the long-run cost function. All right, okie dokie. Bye-bye.